All right, everybody, welcome back. This is the second video for our Module 2 emphasis and focus on behavior and consequences. In video number 1, we talked about two important ideas that come out of behavior theory. The first one is behavior results in consequences, better remembered by the acronym BRIC. Behavior results in consequences. We also talked about how also too that consequences influence behavior. Both of those are true. And we talked a little bit about a little overview and definition of reinforcement and punishment in the first video. So if you've not watched that video already, go back and watch that video. Make sure you got a good handle on that. Also look at your lecture notes and the PowerPoint presentation. And for this little second mini video, two more ideas. So we talked about behavior results in consequences and consequences influence behavior in video 1. Here are the two ideas I want to share with you in video number 2. Again, all of this kind of belongs to these core ideas of behavior theory, this helping approach that we oftentimes use in social services. Here are the two ideas that I also want you to be aware of for this video. And that's this. Consequences are both universal and relative. We could also say it this. Reinforcement and punishment, or consequences, are universal. Consequences, punishment, and reinforcement are also relative, universal and relative. Both of those are true. Let's talk about what that means for a second. So number one, the idea that reinforcement and punishment or consequences are universal. Generally what that means is this. Generally speaking, there are certain kinds of consequences that we experience that for most people tend to strengthen our behavior and therefore they are reinforcers. And there are certain kinds of consequences that generally tend to weaken our behavior, and so therefore they're punishers. Let me give you some examples. So generally speaking, most of us are motivated by money. And in other words, most of us, if you go to work every week, you expect a paycheck. If your job stopped paying you, you would probably stop going. Now, you may not do it for the money, but the money is an important consequence of the work that you do. Money tends to motivate people, generally speaking. And the word motivate there is another word for reinforce. The word motivate and reinforcement are separate ideas, but they're kind of similar in a way. So money tends to be a universal reinforcer. Generally speaking, you get people's attention behaviorally when you offer money. When you say, hey, I'll give you blank, I'll give you this, I'll give you $20, $200, whatever. Money motivates us. It's why people buy lottery tickets. It's why people go to casinos and gamble, right? It's why we get up and go to work every day, many of us, right? Because it's why many of you have taken jobs and you go to work every day in a job you don't like, but because it gives you a paycheck, you go. And hopefully you go and show up on time and try to do a good job so that you can get that paycheck. The paycheck is the consequence. It motivates your behavior, reinforces or motivates your behavior because usually money is what we consider a universal reinforcer. It's something that motivates most of us. Most of us appreciate praise and positive attention. Now, not everyone, but most of us appreciate praise. And that's why praise is a great reinforcing consequence. There's an old rule of thumb that says, whatever behavior you want to see more of in someone else, praise it. If you have a child or students or employees and they're doing something you want them to keep doing, praise them for it. And as a general rule of thumb, people will continue to engage in behavior they are praised for because most of us like praise. It feels good. It's favorable to us. We want it. We like it, most of us. And so therefore praise and what we call positive attention tends to be a universal reinforcer. It tends to strengthen our behavior. When praise is a consequence, it tends to strengthen that behavior. Things like food, things like emotional and psychological or physical pleasure, those are things that generally speaking tend to motivate people to engage in certain behaviors in order to get those things, right? So they tend to be universal reinforcers. Many of you have been on campus before with our human service student organization meetings. We're not having the traditional meetings this semester because we're just not able to gather together face to face. But some of you know, and you've heard me say in my classes, that one of the ways I get students to come to those meetings is I feed people. I give them Chick-fil-A and Domino's Pizza. Now, there are some people who would come even if I didn't feed them, but I guarantee you that I would probably have less than half of the number that I normally get at those meetings when I feed folks. You know why? Because I know that people are hungry and we all like free food. And I know that generally, many, not all, many people like Chick-fil-A and pizza. So that's why I offer Chick-fil-A and pizza. I don't offer lots of, healthy food. Sounds terrible. People don't want that. What people want is Chick-fil-A and pizza. So I offer that. Why do I offer it? Because I know that it tends to be a universal food like that tends to be a universal reinforcer. It brings people, in this case, to a meeting. That's why I feed people. I also do it because I know you're hungry. I want to be a good person, but really, the bottom line, I want you to come to the meeting. And so, because food and because that kind of food, specific kind of food, tends to reinforce people, something that tends to be favorable to most people. That's why I use it as a reinforcer, right? So, physical pleasure, emotional pleasure, um, physical, emotional, psychological pleasure and comfort. Those are all things that generally tend to be consequences that tend to strengthen our behavior. When those kinds of things I just listed are consequences, when those kinds of things are at play, though those generally tend to reinforce people's behavior. That's why they're called universal reinforcers. Not always, but generally. The opposite of that is there are certain consequences that tend to weaken people's behavior generally. So, for example, getting a fine or having money removed from us, because money is something that most of us are willing to work for. It tends to be a positive. It tends to be a universal reinforcer. Well, the opposite then is true. The removal of money, like having to pay a fine or a speeding ticket, tends to be a negative thing. Most of us don't want to give up our money. And so the prospect of losing money is something most of us stay away from. If a behavior I engage in generally involves me losing a lot of money, well, then we tend to stay away from that kind of behavior. So the loss of money or the removal of money tends to be a universal punisher. Um, Physical or emotional or psychological pain or threat. Most of us don't like that. And so we tend to stay away from behaviors where that is a potential consequence. Most of us do not like embarrassment or negative attention. Most of us don't like that. Now, that's not always true, but most of us tend to engage in behavior that doesn't bring us emotional embarrassment or negative attention. Most of us, right? Most of us don't like to be in situations where we have a lot, where there is a loss or of control or power is taken away from us. The old saying goes like this: you don't see people breaking into prison. You see people wanting to get out of prison or jail. Why? Because in prison or jail, a lot of our rights and a lot of our power and control is taken away. People don't want to go to jail. They don't want to go to prison. No one's trying to break in there because it's not a good place. Well, part of why it's not a good place is because a lot of the consequences that you experience there are negative. They're not favorable, and so oftentimes, in any situation, for most people, any situation that where the consequence may be a loss of privilege or a loss of power and control, hopefully we stay away from those behaviors. Right now, not everyone does that, and that oftentimes highlights that may have what we call a behavioral or emotional disorder. If someone cannot or won't stay away from those negative kinds of consequences. But most people generally stay away from those kinds of consequences. And so those kinds of things, removal of money, such as a fine, or physical or emotional pain or threat, or embarrassment or negative attention, the loss or removal of personal power or control, those kinds of consequences tend to be universal punishers. They tend to weaken people's behavior instead of reinforcing or strengthening it, right? So consequences are universal in some ways. Consequences, including reinforcement and punishment, tend to be universal. There's some universality to it in a way. But here's the deal: none of us are robots, right? None of us are robots. None of us are computers. And so all of us have unique things within us that make us different from one another. And so even though reinforcement and punishment are universal in some ways, reinforcement and punishment are also relative. And here's what that means: it just means this. Um, Reinforcement and punishment are relative just means that the same consequence can have a different effect on two different people's behavior. That's what we mean when we say the reinforcement and punishment are relative. It just means that the consequences can have different effects on different people's behaviors. I give you in the lecture notes an example of my son and my daughter. If you've ever raised children or grandchildren, you know that kids are different. All of us are different, right? Even though some consequences are universal, all of us are different. And I have two children, a son and a daughter. If you have more than one child, you know this. You have to use different approaches with different kids. As a professor, as a teacher, I have some general approaches that I use in the classroom, but I also too have some unique specific approaches that I use for individual people because I know that everybody is unique and different. And so the idea that consequences are relative just means that consequences can have different effects on different people's behavior. And there are some factors that kind of come into play. I list several of those for you in your lecture notes. Let me highlight a few of those. So here are some variables that come into play that often can tweak. If I can use the word tweak, it kind of tweaks oftentimes and it plays a role into the effect that a consequence is going to have on a behavior. So for example, immediacy and consistency. Those two are real simple. So generally speaking, we tend to be more influenced. Our behavior tends to be more influenced by consequences that occur immediately or soon after a behavior. If a consequence occurs way after a behavior, it's not as powerful. So the more immediate the consequence is, the more effect it has on our behavior. So that's an example. It's an example of how there can be a little variation there, right? So immediacy is real important. Related to that is consistency. We tend to be influenced more. Our behavior tends to be influenced more by consequences that are consistent. Consequences that are kind of here and there every once in a while, they usually are not very effective on our behavior. So immediacy and consistency are two important variables that often come into play that can influence whether or not a consequence is going to be a reinforcer or a punisher or have any effect at all. Some of you are going to do the TV show review assignment that you're working on right now, the Super Nanny 911 review. I love reading those assignments whenever you write those assignments up for me. Some of you are going to choose to do that assignment. Others of you are going to choose to do instead the textbook review. But for those of you who do the TV show review, I love reading that assignment because I love to see your perspective on what you saw in the episode. I guarantee at least some of you are going to write in your paper how the nanny, the super nanny, worked with the mom and the dad on consistency or immediacy. Because a lot of times, one of the mistakes we make as parents is we're not consistent. We say one thing, we do something else. Then we do something else, and then we say something else different. And we're just not consistent. We get distracted and we lose track of what's going on. We're not immediate in the moment. We don't praise our kids in the moment. We sort of, because we're not paying attention to what's going on. And so therefore, they just ignore us when we try then to intervene, right? So immediacy and consistency are two variables that are often at play when it comes to understanding or predicting the effect that a consequence might have on a behavior. Here's another idea. So immediacy, consistency. The other is the word contingency or connection. So if I were to ask you today, if I were to say, hey, listen, I'll give you $100 if you'll do a favor for me. So I'll give you $100. That's the consequence. If you do a favor for me, that's your behavior. Your behavior is doing me a favor. What's the consequence? $100. Most of you would say, probably, okay, what's the favor? You would want to know. Hopefully, you wouldn't say, oh, no problem. Whatever you want me to do, Professor Killian, I'll just do it. Hopefully, at some point, you would say, well, what do I got to do? And the answer to that question is going to dictate whether or not the $100 is appropriate or not. If I say, hey, if you just come up here and run an errand for me, real simple, $100, you might say, oh, I'll go for it, right? But if I ask you to do multiple things for me, do something that's illegal, inappropriate, goes against your values, your faith, beliefs, or whatever, you might say, no, it's not worth it, right? The connection between the behavior and the consequence. What do I got to do to get the consequence is what we call contingency. It's the connection between the two. And again, that influences whether or not a consequence will influence us or not, is the connection. What do I have to do in order to get the consequence? Is it reasonable? Is it appropriate? Is it something I'm interested in? Is it something I can do? Is it accessible for me to do? Am I able to do it? All of that comes into play all the time. And those kinds of and the idea of contingency or connection influences oftentimes the effect that a consequence has upon a behavior. And then these last two, I give you, if you look in your lecture notes, you'll see the words satiation and deprivation. What the heck is that? Satiation and deprivation. So let me give you a couple of examples of what that is. Satiation just means full, and deprivation just means lacking. So, as a general rule of thumb, we are consequences that represent something that we are lacking have more of an influence on us, as opposed to consequences that we feel we already have enough of, right? Have you ever heard the advice, don't ever go shopping in the grocery store when you're hungry? Because your hunger, being deprived, being hungry, may influence. That hunger is going to be a powerful influencer on your behavior. Same thing is true with other kinds of consequences. As I shared with you earlier, many years ago, I worked in a foster care adoption agency, and I had a foster mom one time share a great example of satiation deprivation. Here's what she shared. So this was a foster mom who, her and her husband oftentimes specialized in younger children, and they were really, really good at working with kids with some behavioral problems. So one of the things that she said was, she said, I was in a support group meeting one night with her. It was a foster parent support group meeting, and she shared how in her house, her and her husband and their children hardly ever eat out. She said that's just kind of our rule. She said, in my house, I cook almost every single meal. So my kids don't eat out. If foster kids come into my home, they don't eat out hardly at all. And so she said, that's just kind of the way we roll, right? She said, I cook, my husband and I cook almost every meal. We don't hardly ever eat out. So because we don't ever eat out, it's a big deal when we do. So she said, I've learned that I can motivate my kids by saying, hey, listen, if you guys will help me this afternoon get the house cleaned up, or if you'll do X, Y, and Z, so she'll propose a behavior. If you do this, I'll give you this. And the consequence is we can go to Whataburger or Sonic, or we'll go out to eat tonight. And she said, when we go out to eat, it's a big old deal, and it's a big deal. And she said, I've learned that I can. She said, as I kind of modify the behavior of my kids. We talked before about how parenting is the greatest example of behavior modification around. She said the fact that my kids don't eat out at all. She didn't use this word, but we would call that a deprivation situation. They don't get a lot of it. What's the consequence? Eating out. Do the kids in her household experience that consequence very much? No, they don't eat out hardly at all. So because they don't experience the consequence very much, when they do, or the prospect of getting it becomes powerful because it's something that they want, right? So that's a good example of deprivation at play. Now, deprivation has kind of a negative connotation. She wasn't like depriving her kids of anything that they need, but it was just one of those deals where those kids did not experience that consequence hardly at all. So when it was proposed as a possible consequence of a behavior, it really got their attention. Imagine if they ate out all the time, every single night, every single night, every single night, every single night. Well, eating out's not a big deal then. That's what we call satiation. Can you imagine eating out every single night, every single night, every single night, every single night, and then someone saying, "Hey, listen, if you'll do X, Y, and Z for me, I'll take you out to eat tonight." Well, I go out to eat every night, so I might not be that the consequence of eating out may not be that powerful on my behavior, may not be that enticing to me, may not be that motivating to me because I'm full of it. What am I full of? Eating out, right? And so consequences that represent to us something that we have a lot of or enough of, those things aren't always as enticing to us. Those things aren't always as motivating to us. That's called satiation, being full of something, right? But things that we don't experience a lot of, well, then like deprivation, that's called deprivation. Those consequences oftentimes get our attention because and they often have a powerful influence on our behavior. Many, many years ago, I'll give you one last example of deprivation. as a good example of this. And satiation is just the opposite of deprivation. Probably 4 or 5 years ago, I was teaching this class in the classroom, and we had this lecture, this basic lecture one morning in class about satiation and deprivation. After class was over, a student came to me and she said, "Can I give you a really good personal example of deprivation?" I said, "Sure." She said, "When I was a kid growing up," she said, "I grew up in a very, very sort of unstable, chaotic environment." She said, "I never felt loved. I never felt anyone gave me any attention." She said, "My parents, it was chaotic and kind of crazy." And she said, "I just kind of grew up being ignored." And so she said, "As a kid, though, I wanted people to notice me." And so she said, because I didn't have a lot of that in my life. It was like a deprivation situation. I said, "Exactly." I said, "What happened then?" She said, "Well, when I started going to school, I would act up. I would act out, and kids would give me attention, and my teacher would give me, even though it was a negative attention, they'd give me attention." And she used this word. She said, "I was starving for it." And because I was starving for it, deprivation, because I was starving for it, I just kept, even though I got in trouble, I just kept doing it. And she said, that attention, she said, it was like something I was just starving for. And she said, I became a teenager. And she said, I got in trouble in some relationships with with some guys, because the first guy that came along and showed me attention, she said, I was like 11 or 12. She said, I was way too young. Like 11 or 12 years old. And the first guy that came along, he was older than me. He gave me some attention. She said, I was starving for it. And before long, I'm engaging in behavior I shouldn't be engaged in as like 11 and 12-year-old kid, 13-year-old kid. But she said, because I didn't really have that love and affection and attention and nurturing that I needed, I was starving for it. And so when someone offered it to me, she said, I engaged in all kinds of behavior to kind of get it. She said, it was powerful, right? That's what we're talking about right here. That's sort of an extreme example of that, right? But this idea that consequences that represent something to us that is a lack that we don't have, those consequences oftentimes are more motivating to us as opposed to things that we're full of, that we're satiated over, right? Satiation means full, deprivation means lack. So all those things, immediacy, consistency, contingency, satiation, deprivation, and then the last one is just this: individual differences. All of us are just uniquely wired in just who we are as people. And your unique temperament and my unique temperament is going to influence what is appealing to us and what is not appealing to us. Some of you, if I were to offer you the consequence of having a long weekend at home, just all by yourself, just reading a book or just hunkered down and hiding out, some of you love that kind of stuff. And you're like, man, if Professor Killian, if you could give me that as a consequence, I would do whatever you needed me to do. Others of you look at that and you say, I mean, that's the worst thing in the world. Last thing I want to do is hang around the house all weekend long. I want to go out and have fun. And if I were to offer you lots of enjoyment or going out to the lake or going and doing a bunch of stuff outside, that would be appealing to you, right? So this is just one example. All of us are different. All of us are different as far as the things that we are drawn to. And individual differences often come into play that influence the effect that consequences have on our behavior. Some consequences are reinforcing to some people because of who they are. Other people's that same consequence, not a big deal to them because of who they are, right? Because of who we are as people, just our individual differences, which can include our experiences, our temperament, our level of maturity, our background, our culture, our ethnicity, our religious faith or beliefs, all of that comes into play, right? And kind of makes us who we are as unique people. And those individual differences also can come into play and have an impact on whether a consequence is going to be reinforcing or punishing to us, or what it may be, right? So individual differences come into play. So immediacy, consistency, contingency, satiation, deprivation, and then individual differences. All of those are just factors to keep in mind that can and do oftentimes play a different role in the effect that a consequence is going to have on a behavior. And that's part of what we mean when we say consequences are relative. They're both universal and relative. When we say they're relative, we mean that the same consequence can have a different influence on different people's behavior. So, okay, so all of that, both of these two little mini lecture videos for Module 2 have to do with behavior and consequences, BC. So we're wrapping up in this lecture the core ideas of behavior theory. Look at the PowerPoint presentation, read through the lecture notes, do your homework, look at the handouts, get ready for quiz number 1, which will be here in the next couple of weeks. And I will see you next time. Have a good one.